We have a veteran here. And more recently, writing and speaking about her findings, her review on the evolutionary appropriateness and benefit of weaning babies onto a meat-based, high-fat, low-carb diet was included as testimony defending Tim Noakes in his recent trial. The carnivore queen has been eating a plant-free diet since 2009. Please welcome Amber O'Hearn.
Hi, thank you. So just briefly, if you don't know my story, I had been on a low-carb diet for 12 years and had through I don't know exactly why, but I had multiple pregnancies. I was older. I was on antidepressant medications, and I had found myself nearly at 200 pounds, and I was ready to try just about anything. And I tried a carnivore diet, which was called zero carb back then, but plant-free. And it not only did it start immediately helping with the weight problem that I had, but I also, it put my bipolar disorder to rest, and I've been medication-free for almost 10 years now. All right. Yes, so the question then that's been kind of on my mind for a very long time is there any benefit to eating plants if you're on a ketogenic diet? Or to put it more negatively, is there any problem if you're on a ketogenic diet to not eating plants? And so I've been looking at various aspects of this question for a very long time. We know that meat can give you fat, which is mostly used for energy, and it can give you protein, which is mostly used for structure. But what else is there? We could talk about essential nutrients, but I'm not going to do that today. I've talked about it before, but especially you should look into the work of Georgia Ede, who is a great hero of mine and who has talked extensively about the differences between animal-based and plant-based nutrition. And the takeaway from that is that if you can't get it from animal foods, you don't need it. I mean, just plain and simple, there is no essential nutrient that you can't get from an animal-based food. But there is more to nutrition than essential nutrients, it turns out. So one way you might think about it is you've got all these things that you need, and there are certain things that you can make, and the definition of an essential nutrient is something that you need but you can't make. And then there's this gray area, or purple, I guess, where it's something that you need, but you can make it. There's a lot of contention about conditionally essential nutrients because the condition is that you have to have the substrates, you have to have the things that you're going to synthesize the nutrient out of. And different conditions in your life could make you need more or less of it. And most of these are things that you can make some of, but you either may need to make more than you are able to make just by the limitations of the human physiology, or you may need more at certain times in your life. So this can become very contentious about whether or not something gets named essential. It might be essential in the sense that we need it, even though we can make it. For some sense of completion, there are things that you make that you don't need, and I guess those are just waste products. And for even more completion, there are things outside of this whole realm of things that you need and you make. And I can't really think of any other things than toxins and drugs, and maybe inert. I've got a question mark here because is there really anything that you can put through your body that there's zero response to? Maybe there are, I'm not sure about that. And then I'm just going to change the vocabulary a bit. In case you haven't heard these terms, you all probably have, but endogenous means you make it, endo is in, genus is make, and then exogenous is something that you're taking in from the outside. So, this Eat the Rainbow graphic encapsulates the common, and as I'll argue, quite poorly supported view that we should be eating plants in the diet for their phytochemical activity. Phyto means plant. It's acknowledged that these are not essential nutrients. They're not something that you need, exactly because the body doesn't need doesn't need them. So how could they possibly be good for us? One idea, the one that's on the website that I stole that graphic from and that's on many other websites, is that they're providing antioxidants. It's a discredited idea, but it's still widely believed. And the idea being that these chemicals help us because of their antioxidant activity. Well, it's true that many of them do have antioxidant power in a petri dish. So if you put them in a dish with oxidation and you watch what happens, they will antioxidize. And why do we care about that? What is oxidation? Well, oxidative stress is something that we know is associated with things that we don't want, like cancer, like cardiovascular disease, also known as metabolic syndrome, neurodegenerative diseases, and even aging is associated with this. So what is oxidation? You'll often see ROS standing for reactive oxygen species. Don't let that term fool you. Species just means type. Oxygen is because they have oxygen. There's also a series that uses nitrogen. And it's reactive because they're chemically reactive in the body. They have extra electrons, and everything they touch kind of spreads this oxidation around in a chain reaction, and this can damage lipids and proteins and our DNA, none of which we feel very comfortable with. And free radicals or reactive oxygen species can come from both endogenously or exogenous. A well-known, talked about exogenous source is smoking. So this oxidative stress then gets talked about in an imbalance theory where you have too much reactive oxygen species that's pulling down and not enough antioxidants to balance it. Well, imbalance theories always send off red flags for me, because most of the time what they do is they set up an equation that makes people think that they know where the causality is. So the canonical example in our community is calories in, calories out, where the idea is if you just take in less energy or spend more energy, you'll lose fat, but that misses the point that there are hormonal mechanisms that are regulating energy, and you can't just intercept that whole system from the outside. Moreover, it doesn't really tell you anything. My favorite example or illustration of this is from Tom Naughton of Fathead. In one of his books, he has a cartoon with a plumber who's looking and saying, "Oh, I see the problem. There's more water coming in than there is going out." Well, okay, it doesn't fix anything. How does that help me to know that? So the argument goes that if only we were eating enough of these antioxidants, then we wouldn't be out of balance. And I should note that this kind of argument comes from a prior belief, usually based in epidemiology, if you find that kind of argumentation persuasive, that plant eating must be helping us somehow, so maybe this is the mechanism we've been looking for. The problem is it doesn't actually work. So xenobiotics are, xeno means foreign, like xenophobia. And so if you have something that comes in, it's exogenous and it's foreign, that's a xenobiotic, it's a toxin. Plants are full of things that are, to us, xenobiotics, and it's a long time evolved biochemical warfare between plants and the herbivores that have been eating them, starting with insects. And their defenses include many kinds of chemical toxins. So some are just going to kill the assailant right off the bat. Some are going to be hormone disruptors that make it so that if you've eaten me, you can't develop properly and reproduce, which is a problem for you. And some are digestive inhibitors that will cause malnourishment if you eat me, and many other types of things. I'll just touch on a few classes. So we have alkaloids, which are common in nightshades. They can alter metabolism, they can interfere with DNA repair, they can interfere with nerve transmission. We have cyanogenic glycosides. These are really neat because they're poisonous to the plant too. The plant has to hold two chemicals that when they come together will react and make the cyanogenic glycosides, and they're activated by a bite. These are actually a serious problem in the world today in places that rely on, this is a picture of cassava, or otherwise known as tapioca. If you don't process that very carefully, it causes nerve damage, and it's a problem in certain parts of the world. And we have terpenoids, which are related to turpentine. We have phenolics, which are the darling of the modern world, because we want to think, and maybe it's true, that they can be used medicinally. And there are many different types of these, and there are many more. So when you take something into your body, the first thing that your body has to decide is this something I want to make into part of me, or is this something that is foreign and I do not want? And so if you say, yes, I want this, you use it to make energy, you use it to make structure. If you say no, then you turn on your defense mechanisms. So that defense is going to start with these plants as a bitter taste in your mouth. You say, no, I'm spitting this out, I'm not even going to eat it. If it gets past that defense mechanism, most of it doesn't get absorbed, so you escort it right out. And some of it will get absorbed, and that little bit that does get absorbed immediately gets conjugated, which means it becomes more water soluble so you can excrete it. So very little will actually get through for many of these compounds if your body is working properly to detoxify. This is one of my favorite studies, and the reason that it's my favorite is because they found something that was surprising to them and not really exactly relevant to the outcome they were looking at, but they published it anyway, and I think that's really laudable. So what they were trying to do is they had smokers, which we know causes oxidation, and they wanted to find out if this isolated green tea extract could help with the oxidative stress of smoking. And they were smart enough to realize, or at least at the time it was still believed, that the antioxidants that would be in these rainbow vegetables might be having an effect. So the first thing that they did was they took all those colorful plants out of the subjects' diets, and so that wouldn't interfere. It turned out that green tea extract didn't really help very much, so they didn't have anything to publish there. But what they did notice was that the comparison of taking out those plants that are supposed to be so full of antioxidants did have an effect on the oxidation status of their subjects. Their effect was taking out those plants led to a decrease in protein oxidation, a decrease in this marker of oxidation, deoxo-DG, an increased resistance of plasma lipoproteins to oxidation, all when you took out the antioxidant vegetables. So it doesn't even work in practice. So if plant bioactives aren't acting via this antioxidant value, then if they're giving us a benefit, and there are some studies with some isolates from plant extracts that have medicinal effect, well, how are they acting? So when you take something in, again, you're deciding if you want it or not, but another thing that happens is that it sends your body a signal about what the nutritional environment is like. And as Ben Beekman talked about extensively yesterday, there are basically two phases that we can be in metabolically. We can be in what he called, and I think it's a good name, the anabolic phase, or the catabolic phase, but other words that have been used to describe these, for anabolic, we would say it's the glucose burning phase, it's the synthesis, recovery phase, the fed state. Catabolic, you're recycling because it's associated with autophagy. It's the ketogenic phase, the challenge phase, the fasting state. Notice that both of these are sometimes called the repair phase, and it's a bit confusing. Technically, if you're building it up, that's a kind of repair, but also if you're tearing down things that are broken, that's also kind of a repair. I'm just, for fun, for today, to see if this works, because I've had so much trouble with this terminology, I'm going to try calling this the matter phase and the energy phase. So when you're in the matter phase, you're mostly turning energy into matter, into your own tissue. And if you're in the energy phase, you're turning matter into energy. Here, this is from a paper from Mattson and others that is describing these phases. And the point of this paper, they call it the intermittent metabolic switching theory. And they say it's really important that you get to both of these phases, because if you're always in the anabolic phase or the matter phase, you never have a chance to tear down and clean up. But if you're always in the fasting state, then you never have a chance to build up. And humans actually have an ability to do both of those, which is really remarkable. This is from Cahill, and he's describing on a high-carb diet where it takes like 4 hours after you eat and the meat here isn't about eating meat, it's actually about eating carbs, but you're in that phase where you're completely building things up, because it's going to take you 4 hours to get all the glucose out of your system, for one thing. And only then can you start relying on the glycogen and start to deplete that. And then over the course of about 2 days, you can get to this wonderful fasting state by not eating any food. We have a better way to do it, because instead of going through this absorptive phase where you're taking in all that glucose and dealing with it, if you're on a ketogenic diet, once you've eaten, you're immediately in this post-absorptive phase, and it's all much quicker. I would argue that on a ketogenic diet, even when you eat a full meal, you're going to be in the energy phase at least once a day. So what stimulates the energy phase? It's really, if you look at these different things, it's really about energy demand. So if you're fasting or calorically restricted, you have an energy demand. If you restrict glucose or protein, and just a quick note, it can be either. So a lot of people in the plant-based community and even people in the keto community say you can't get autophagy if you don't restrict protein. It's not really true. The mTOR will be inhibited with total restriction of one or the other. Exercise definitely is an energy demand, but protein restriction isn't really an energy demand, and bitter foods aren't an energy demand. What they do signal is a poor nutritional environment, and so that's the other way that you can stimulate this phase. So interestingly, this actually comes back to oxidative stress. We don't really need to know the details of this picture, but it's showing the electron transport chain, and all along the generation of energy in the mitochondria, there are these little places where oxygen will get out. Reactive oxygen species will get out. And that's normal. It kind of looks like a leak, and if you talk about it like a leak, you might think, oh, this is just something that biological systems do inefficiently, and so this is why we need this antioxidation to make up for this mistake in function. But as other people have mentioned, oxidation actually has a function of signaling, and maybe it's just that we learned to take this as a signal of energy status. So, if you're in the anabolic mode and you have oxidation, what that's telling you is that you're getting a lot of energy toward you, but you don't want to be actually burning a lot of energy. So that oxidation is just kind of a measure of how much energy you've been getting, especially if you're burning glucose. And that will eventually signal to you to stop taking in as much energy, and it'll be you'll become insulin resistant, and you're definitely still, it's reinforcing the storage mode. If you get oxidation and you're in the energy demand mode, then what you do is you don't want to slow down the energy because you've got the energy demand. So instead what happens is you call on antioxidants to just deal with that signal. And we definitely don't need to understand all of this picture either. It's also from Mattson, that earlier paper I had. But I just wanted to draw your attention to this part here where there's a bioenergetic sensor. So this is really what's telling you to go into this autophagy phase. There's also bioenergetic sensing up here. It's more about fat oxidation versus glucose oxidation, but note that it's sending a signal here that ultimately ends up turning on this antioxidant response, and it has to do with this thing called NRF2. Notice it's mentioned here 2 times, and I just very briefly, because I got tripped over this. There are 2 different things called NRF2, and so they're different, and to add to the confusion, they're both actually triggered by this master hormone that Ben was talking about, or transcription factor that Ben was talking about yesterday. So it's very confusing, but they are different things, and so I'm going to call the one that we usually care about NFE2L2. So one of the main signaling pathways for antioxidation is this NFE2L2, and it gets bound up in KEAP1, which keeps it from being activated. But that gets inhibited by the energy phase. So 2 negatives make a positive, and so if you're in the energy demand mode, that will turn on the antioxidants. But if you're getting toxins from the environment, it turns out that those are also going to inhibit KEAP1, and so that's another way that you can activate those antioxidants that has nothing to do with the energy deficit mode. And by the way, I've got smoking on there because yes, smoking and sulforaphane work by the same toxin-inducing mechanisms, and I first was led to think about it that way by Chris Masterjohn because he talked about this and how it may be just about dose. So nobody says, oh, you want to activate your NFE2L2 pathway, you should start smoking, but I don't know. Just eat vegetables. But if you're this works even if you're in the energy surplus mode, if you're in the energy to matter mode, the anabolic mode. So even when you're there, you don't need that energy demand in order to activate this pathway. But it seems to me like if you're doing that, you might only be getting a partial benefit, and the metaphor that comes to my mind is taking exogenous ketones or MCT oil. It might get some of the pathways activated that you want, but because you're not actually in that whole energy deficit or energy demand mode, you may not be getting all of the benefits. Okay, so that brings us to the topic of hormesis. It was noticed in the field of toxicology that organisms tend to have a biphasic response to toxins. That is, at a low dose, they'll actually be really good for them and makes the organism stronger. But at a certain point, the toxicity overwhelms the response. So the problem is, how do you know where those amounts are, right? If the dose makes the poison, then we need to know what the dose is. And clinically, the effective doses that people have found in studies are really actually hard to achieve with food. So one of the best known activators is sulforaphane. It's highest it's in all the cruciferous, but it's highest in broccoli sprouts. And so I was reading this paper called Sulforaphane and Other Nutrigenomic NRF2 Activators, Can the Clinician's Expectation Be Matched by the Reality? And they figure that it would take about 5 cups of broccoli sprouts to get to that level that's been seen in the rodent studies. But then, cooking destroys it. If you put it in the fridge for a while, it destroys it. And then how do you know that the person who's making your broccoli sprouts, or even if it's you, that your variety has that higher amount? It seems like this isn't something that you would really consider a food effect. And the whole point of that article was, we can't do it with food, so how are we going to get this into supplements? And then going on with the dose problem, suppose you even knew you were getting enough. Are you going to eat this every day, or should you be pulsing it? Should you be giving a break? We don't even know. And then there's whatever else is coming along with it. Also, we don't know. Right. So unless you're actually eating fresh broccoli sprouts, the hormesis effect you're after might not even really be a real thing. And to just put a finer point on it, here's the situation with resveratrol, which is widely touted as being a longevity thing. You should be drinking your red wine and your chocolate. Well, okay, 3 kilograms of chocolate. Maybe if you've got a really nice variety of wine, you might be able to do it with 500 liters, or a mere 52.6 kilograms of tomatoes. Here's the rub. A ketogenic diet is already putting you in the energy demand phase. So it's already upregulating this thing that you're trying to get to by drinking your 500 liters of wine. Okay, so then the clever people in the audience will be going, so wait a minute, does that mean that ketogenesis is actually toxic and maybe we should only have a little bit of it or limit it or only have it sometimes? And there are 2 important answers to this. One is yes and one is no. The only paper that I know of that really talks about this problem in a meaningful way is from last year with Miller, Villamina, and Volek. And it's an excellent paper, and it talks about so many aspects of all these pathways, and I couldn't even possibly begin to, well, honestly, understand all of it. But they're talking about ketosis and mitohormesis, and one of the main takeaways that I got from that paper was a pattern that is exemplified by this other paper, where they were looking at the hippocampal cells of rats, and they put them on a ketogenic diet. And on the first day, they had reactive oxygen species going up, so that the hydrogen peroxide production went up. And after 3 days, they're able to see the results of this oxidation, for example, through glutathione being oxidized. After a week, finally the antioxidants start kicking in. But that effect persisted through the whole study. And then further, 3 weeks in, the reactive oxygen species production starts going down, and in fact it goes down below baseline, but we've still got the antioxidation activity. So that seems like kind of ideal, and maybe that's one way of thinking about keto adaptation when you've got all that process in line. So why would the oxidation go down if you're still in this high energy demand mode? Well, that's just, I think, simply because when you're making energy from fat and ketones, it actually generates less oxidative stress than when you're burning glucose for fuel. So it's kind of a green fuel. So my conclusion from this is that if you're going to add plants, the toxins from plants, on a ketogenic diet, it's not really much of a conclusion. Well, either it's useless because it's redundant, we're already there. Maybe it's actually harmful because now you're getting more toxins, but there's no added antioxidant benefit because you've already got that. Or maybe there's a possible world in which it's still actually beneficial because it's adding this extra antioxidant response that maybe is helpful. I don't actually know. We don't know. And I think that it's really going to depend. So if you already have a high toxic burden and you've already got your antioxidant generation endogenously going really strongly, does it help you to add more toxins from plants? Maybe not, especially if you're a person like me who has found really measurable benefits to removing plants. I suspect that there's no world in which it's better for me to be doing that. And it may depend on your insulin state. So suppose that you've got baseline high hyperinsulinemia and it's preventing you from getting into a deep ketogenic mode, or preventing you from getting the full benefit of being in a ketogenic mode. Maybe that is a situation where this kind of activity might help. But I don't think it's clear at all. And anyone who claims that you're going to get a hormetic benefit, I think the first question you should ask them is, how do you know? So that's plant bioactives. It turns out there are many animal food bioactives. Most people who are in the plant-based world and talk about bioactives don't talk about these ones. I'm only going to touch on a few. There are many, many. Taurine is one. It's high in meat and fish. It's absent in plants. Blood values are low in vegetarians, which means that even though we can synthesize it, they're making less than what an omnivore would get. And that suggests that, if you think that a natural human diet contained meat, that we might have been expecting to get some. It's essential for infants. They don't yet have the ability to synthesize it at all, and in adults, there's limited synthesis. If you put patients on total parenteral nutrition, where they're just getting a feeder, and you don't give them taurine, they will become deficient. So that indicates to me that maybe it should be considered essential. Taurine's kind of strange. It's an amino acid, but it's not incorporated into proteins. It doesn't participate in many reactions, but it is yet the most prevalent free amino acid in tissues, especially the heart, the brain, and the liver. So what's it doing? It used to be just considered an end product. But things that it's important for include brain and retinal development, some things with osmosis and calcium modulation, electrolyte balance. It stabilizes membranes. It's needed for reproduction. It has a role in immunity. If there are clinical studies showing that it has effects on insulin and can improve insulin sensitivity, and perhaps, funnily enough, it's an antioxidant, but it doesn't participate itself in antioxidizing, and in fact, we don't actually know why it's an antioxidant. We just know that if you give it to people who are under conditions of traumatic oxidative stress, that it helps with the oxidation. And so here's an example of a paper that is a review of different things that taurine has been used for therapeutically. In particular, congestive heart failure in Japan, it's an approved treatment for that, but they are suggesting in this paper that it may also be helpful for metabolic issues and many other things. The most amusing study to me that I found on taurine is actually epidemiology. It's the only epidemiology slide that you'll see in my presentation. These researchers decided that taurine intake was so important, and they were motivated in part by the benefit that has been seen in stroke in certain situations. They decided that it should be responsible for the longevity in the so-called blue zones, and so they tried to fit a curve to that and argue that taurine is the longevity factor in all of those places. Okay, so carnitine is another one. Oh, I forgot to mention about taurine. Taurine is, the name comes from Taurus, a bull, because it was first found in ox bile. Carnitine is obviously named after meat. It's almost exclusively in meat. I did not know until yesterday when Doc Nally mentioned on one of his slides that it could be found in avocado. I was, no way, yeah. It's true, though. There is a little bit in there. It's, again, considered conditionally essential. We have limited biosynthesis of it. And again, vegetarians have lower levels, but they do conserve it better. The kidneys get very good at retaining it and not excreting it, if you're a vegetarian. Carnitine is absolutely essential for fatty acid metabolism. It's important for heart function. It's important for the endothelial cells. I argued recently at the Carnivore conference that it's important for, it spares vitamin C, because vitamin C is used to make it. It also has been shown to give improvement in cardiac ischemia and also in glucose tolerance. The glucose tolerance was in, unlike the previous one, was in a non-human animal. And I just have a picture from a study about that where the standard chow is showing the blood glucose in the top chart for a standard chow. And when you put rodents on a they say high fat, but it's also high fat, high carb, glucose stimulating, obesogenic diet for rats, their blood glucose response goes way up, and that's mitigated a bit if you give them carnitine. And likewise, you can see that their insulin response is mitigated by carnitine. Creatine is also named after meat because krias is the Greek word for meat, and you'll see that in other words like creature. So it only comes from animal foods. It's conditionally essential. And in omnivores, people who eat meat and plants tend to get about as much creatine from their food as they do from biosynthesis. I imagine that someone like me gets maybe 4 times as much from their food. So what does creatine do? It's involved in recycling of ATP in the brain and in the muscle, and there have been some studies showing improved anaerobic power and performance in the use of supplemental creatine, and there are anecdotal reports of cognitive performance, but I don't think that's ever been verified. So, is this silly though? Because all of these treatment modalities have the same dosage problems that I was just picking on and complaining about with the plant-based bioactives. So these experiments with taurine were about 3 grams a day, so that's 10 pounds of beef heart, a little less if you're going to eat turkey. Carnitine, you got to eat 6 pounds of beef. Maybe Sean Baker can do it, but I don't think that Sean Baker can do 20 kilograms of beef to get the amount of creatine that these supplements are giving. I think maybe it's a bit crazy to consider these as real food effects, but when you think about the commonalities of these bioactives compared to the plant ones, these are all conditionally essential nutrients. That means they're things that we make, and if they're essential and you're benefiting from getting more, it suggests to me that maybe something that you're doing is causing a deficit. Either you're not eating as much as your body evolutionarily expects you to, or you're doing something that's actually depleting you of those nutrients. And so my suspicion is that the reason those help so much is you've got people who are in this chronic state of deficiency, and so you're giving them an overload and it's helping them get back to where they should be. The other thing to notice about all of those things is that they all have something to do with energy metabolism, and I think that's another big hint to us that something about the conditions of the regular diet is interfering with energy in a way that these compounds can actually be helpful. So it looks to me a lot more like a deficiency than a drug action, which means if you get benefit from meat compounds, then it seems to me like it's because it's providing nutrition. And if you get benefit from the plant compounds, it seems to me that it's stimulating something that's only really needed when you aren't stimulating those pathways by your diet. And if you do benefit from it, maybe it's because you're using it as a medicine. And if you're going to be using it as a medicine, then why pretend that it's about food and try to guess your way to the right dose about salad? Why not just find the amount that we know clinically works and isolate that and use that as a medicine? I have nothing against medicines per se. And so that's my conclusion.
Thank you, Amber.